Picture yourself in a muddy village square in 14th century France, the air heavy with the tang of smoke and manure. A knight stands before you, his armor catching the dim light, his posture proud despite the dents in his breastplate. To you, he's a vision of glory, a warrior bound by honor, destined for epic deeds. But look closer. His eyes are hollow, his hands tremble slightly, and the weight of his gear seems to press him into the earth. This man isn't living a legend. He's trapped in a system that demands everything: his wealth, his health, his soul, while offering nothing but the faint promise of glory. The first truth about knighthood is the most shocking. Most knights were desperately poor, teetering on the edge of ruin. Knighthood wasn't a ticket to wealth, but a lifelong debt sentence. The feudal system granted knights land, a fief to support their role as warriors. But that land was no gold mine. It was a patchwork of fields worked by peasants, yielding just enough to survive, if the weather cooperated. A single drought or flood could slash a knight's income, yet his obligations never wavered. He had to serve his lord in battle, often for 40 days a year, bringing his own armor, weapons, horses, and retinue. A suit of plate armor cost more than a peasant earned in 15 years. A warhorse? Another decade's wages. Factor in swords, lances, maintenance, servants, and feeding a household, and the expenses piled up like a mountain. Knights didn't draw salaries. They scraped by on what their land produced, and it was rarely enough. To keep up, many knights borrowed heavily, mortgaging their fiefs to rich lords or merchants at crushing interest rates. Family heirlooms, swords forged for ancestors, reliquaries holding saints' relics, were pawned to buy horse feed or repair a dented helmet. Some sold their daughters into strategic marriages, trading their children's futures for a few more years of solvency. The pressure was relentless, and it broke entire families. Noble bloodlines, some centuries old, vanished, not in glorious battle, but under the weight of debt. The dukes and earls, the top 1% of the knightly class, lived the life we imagine. Castles, feasts, private armies. But they weren't the ones fighting. They lent money to desperate knights, profiting off their misery in a brutal game of medieval capitalism cloaked in talk of honor. If a knight was injured and couldn't fight, there was no safety net. No pension, no charity, just a slide into poverty and shame. Imagine defining your entire existence by your ability to wield a sword, only to lose it all because of a broken leg or a festering wound. Creditors would seize your land, your peers would shun you, and your family would bear the stigma of your failure. For many, death was the only escape from that kind of disgrace. The chronicles and romances of the time, often written for those wealthy lords, painted knighthood as a noble calling. They had to, without the myth, who would endure such a life? But for most knights, every day was a gamble between survival and bankruptcy, a far cry from the gleaming legend we've inherited. Now, step into the knight's world a little deeper, where even the simplest acts of living were a trial. If you think poverty was the worst of it, consider something more primal: hygiene. In our modern world of showers and soap, it's hard to grasp how filthy medieval life was. Knights didn't just neglect cleanliness, they shunned it. Bathing was rare, maybe 3 or 4 times a year, because many believed washing weakened the body, inviting disease. Under their armor, knights wore the same linen undergarments for months, turning them into havens for lice, fleas, and infections. These weren't mere nuisances. Fleas could carry plague, and a simple cut could turn septic, killing as surely as a sword. To mask the stench, knights doused themselves in perfumes and spices, creating a sickening blend of sweat and saffron. Picture sitting beside a man who hasn't bathed since last Easter. but smells like he rolled in a spice merchant's stall. This wasn't laziness. It was cultural. Cleanliness was suspect, a sign of vanity or weakness. Some saw filth as proof of piety, showing you cared more for God's work than your body. In a world where disease was divine punishment, being dirty was almost virtuous. But the real horror came in armor. Full plate, weighing 60 pounds, was a logistical nightmare for basic needs. Going to the bathroom required 2 servants and 20 minutes to unfasten key plates. On campaign, or during a siege, that was impossible. So, many knights relieved themselves inside their armor, urinating or defecating where they stood. Some suits had crude drainage systems or removable padding, but it didn't make the experience less degrading. After hours of battle, a knight's armor was a reeking, sweat-soaked cage. Castle life offered little relief. Toilets were communal, often just wooden seats over a moat or river, with no privacy or sanitation. Knights sat shoulder to shoulder, discussing strategy or gossip while the stench rose. Toilet paper didn't exist. Straw leaves or a quick rinse with the hand was the norm. Castles had separate summer and winter toilet towers to manage the smell, but it was still overpowering. Disease thrived in these conditions, and knights weren't spared. Dysentery, typhus, and skin infections were rampant, and medical care amounted to prayers or herbal brews that often did more harm than good. The filth wasn't just physical. It was a mindset, one that saw suffering as noble, even holy. But the battlefield brought a different kind of suffering, one where the knight's greatest asset became his deadliest foe. Plate armor, celebrated as the pinnacle of medieval engineering, was a double-edged sword. In the cool forests of Europe, it offered unmatched protection, deflecting arrows and blades. But in the wrong conditions, it was a torture device. On a summer day, the metal absorbed heat like a furnace, pushing internal temperatures past 120 degrees Fe. Knights cooked alive, their sweat pooling inside with nowhere to escape. Breathing grew labored as the humid air in their helmets thickened. During the Crusades, European knights collapsed in the Middle Eastern deserts, felled not by swords but by heat exhaustion. Entire units succumbed to hyperthermia, their armor turning from shield to oven. Knights tried desperate measures to cope. Servants poured cold water through armor gaps, but the relief was fleeting, and wet metal conducted heat even faster. Some wore ice-soaked cloths beneath their plates, but these melted in summer or caused frostbite in winter. The savviest knights fought at dawn or dusk to avoid the sun's peak, but battles rarely followed their schedule. They faced a brutal choice: keep the armor on and risk roasting, or remove it and face certain death from enemy weapons. The physical toll was staggering: chronic kidney damage, heart conditions, neurological issues from repeated overheating. Some knights passed out before the fighting began, spared the agony of battling in a walking sauna. The mental strain was just as fierce. Every time a knight donned his armor, he knew it could betray him. He was gambling his life, hoping he could outlast the heat before it outlasted him. Campaign after campaign, year after year, this fear gnawed at them. We fret about deadlines or traffic. Knights lived with the constant dread that their own gear could kill them. Their world was a crucible, and the battlefield was where they burned hottest. That brings us to the spectacle of tournaments, where knighthood's brutality was on full display. Forget the modern idea of jousting as a gentleman's sport. Medieval tournaments, or melees, were savage, chaotic wars with spectators. Hundreds of knights clashed in sprawling free-for-alls, wielding sharpened swords, lances, and warhammers. The only guideline was to avoid killing too many opponents, but that was loosely enforced. A single tournament could claim dozens of lives, trampled by horses, crushed by falling knights, or bludgeoned by weapons that shattered bones through helmets. The 1285 tournament at Chivalry left over 60 knights dead in a day, a toll that shocked even a society accustomed to violence. Losing wasn't just a blow to pride. It was financial ruin. Defeated knights surrendered their horses, armor, and weapons, often their only valuable assets. For a knight already drowning in debt, this was catastrophic. Many fought beyond their strength, risking death to avoid bankruptcy, knowing surrender could leave their families destitute. Medical care was a cruel joke. Monks prayed over mangled bodies, and if you didn't wake from a concussion, they'd start planning your funeral. The crowds roared, thrilled by the carnage, though some recoiled, vomiting or fainting at the sight of knights torn apart. Yet knights kept fighting, driven by necessity and fear. Refusing to compete meant social suicide. Cowardice was a stain worse than death. Tournaments also fed the ransom culture, where knights became professional kidnappers. Capturing a wealthy opponent alive was more lucrative than killing them, turning battlefields into violent treasure hunts. A knight's ransom, based on his rank and wealth, could rival the value of a village. But collecting it was a gamble. Families bankrupted themselves, selling land or marrying off daughters to free their kin. Some knights languished in captivity for years. King John II of France spent 4 after Poitiers, his ransom nearly collapsing the French economy. Captives were treated well to preserve their value, but the psychological torture was deliberate, their lives hinging on their family's wealth. Bonds formed between captors and captives, only to dissolve when they met again in battle. War was a bizarre social game, where profit trumped loyalty. This ransom system warped strategy. Knights ignored orders to chase high-value targets, costing battles and lives. It was a world where greed and violence intertwined, and knights were both hunters and prey. But the deepest wound of knighthood lay not in battle but in the soul, where faith and violence clashed in a devastating contradiction. Knights were told they were God's warriors, their swords sanctified by the church. Killing infidels or heretics was a holy duty, a guaranteed ticket to heaven. But this clashed with Christian teachings of love and forgiveness, creating a psychological chasm. Knights attended mass splattered with blood, took communion with hands that had strangled foes, and slept believing they served the Prince of Peace. The church offered absolution, special masses, indulgences, pilgrimages, to ease their guilt, but it often emboldened them to kill more, convinced their souls were secure. The mental toll was catastrophic. Many knights suffered what we'd call PTSD, but their world saw it as divine wrath or demonic possession. Some became fanatics, seeing every fight as a crusade, torturing prisoners while praying or burning villages in God's name. Others abandoned faith, cloaking their cynicism in religious rhetoric. The most tragic believed they were saints while committing horrors, reciting hymns as they razed towns, claiming to purify through violence. Chroniclers recount knights driven mad, speaking to angels, having violent visions, or fleeing to the wilderness as hermits, broken by their contradictions. When knighthood's burdens became unbearable, many turned rogue. Chivalry was a flimsy leash, meant to control armed men but failing spectacularly. Desperate knights embraced private warfare, banditry, dressed as honor. They set up illegal tolls, raided villages, and extorted merchants, acting like medieval crime lords. Guts von Berlichingen, a German knight, became a warlord, kidnapping traders and waging private wars while claiming to defend his dignity. During the 100 Years' War, Mercenary companies of rogue knights sacked towns and switched sides for profit, loyal only to gold. Peasants suffered most, defenseless against these armored predators. A knight could rape or kill a commoner with impunity, knowing no one could challenge him. Entire regions descended into lawlessness, where even legitimate knights traveled in fear. The church tried to curb this with excommunication threats, but desperate men ignored spiritual penalties when starvation loomed. The feudal system, built on knights' loyalty, had birthed its own monsters. The romantic image of knighthood was a lie, a propaganda campaign to glorify a life of poverty, violence, and moral decay. Today we have laws, therapy, and safety nets. Knights had prayer, crude surgery, and the constant threat of ruin. So, as you sit in your air-conditioned room, grumbling about work or bills, think of the knight, roasting in his armor, drowning in debt, haunted by his sins, and one misstep from oblivion. Their world wasn't heroic. It was a brutal trap, and they were its victims. The past wasn't a golden age. It was a forge that burned those it shaped. If this journey through the real medieval world hit you, drop a comment below. Tell me what shocked you most. And if you want more unfiltered history, hit that subscribe button. Let's keep digging into the truths they don't teach in school.